If I told you that in the brutal theater of World War II, the ultimate weapon used to defeat those steel submarines wasn't some cutting-edge technology or a massive depth charge, but a bucket of sour leftovers, would you believe me? You might think I am joking. Just imagine it, a few pieces of moldy bread and a pile of discarded shaved potato peels, miraculously becoming the decisive factor in a deadly game of cat and mouse deep beneath the freezing ocean surface. This isn't some wild science fiction script cooked up by a Hollywood writer. It is a true story of psychological war, human nature, and extreme survival instincts that actually took place in the abyssal depths of the treacherous sea. Today, let us dive into those freezing, dark waters and uncover a shocking truth buried by the long river of history. Why did an ordinary submarine chef start throwing discarded items into the sea? And how did it reverse the battle? The clock winds back to March 14, 1943. The vast expanse of the North Atlantic was shrouded in the gloom of despair and death. The seawater here was bone-chilling, and fierce winds whipped up monstrous waves. But the true terror lurked beneath the turbulent surface, about 380 miles southwest of Iceland. An escort fleet of the British Royal Navy was navigating this sea of death. The sonar operator's face was very pale, beads of cold sweat forming on his forehead as he pressed his headphones tightly to his ears. It was a chilling sound. Target bearing 270 degrees, distance 1,200 yards, and moving at a very high speed. Even more terrifying, the glowing sonar screen showed not just one, but multiple ghost-like dots pulsing very ominously. Major Frederick Walker, a commander with a ruthless and eagle-eyed reputation in the realm of submarine hunting, strode quickly to the chart table. His gaze, sharp as a blade, locked onto the three distinct underwater targets on the map. Without hesitation, without any wishful thinking, he knew exactly what they had encountered: the notorious tactic of the Nazi German Navy, the Wolfcap. These U-boats, prowling the deep sea like starving wolves smelling blood, were preparing to launch a cold-blooded, coordinated slaughter on the Allied convoy. For the past 6 long months, this cold stretch of ocean had become a literal graveyard for Allied merchant ships, over 500 large vessels, fully loaded with life-saving supplies, had been mercilessly dragged to the ocean floor by these deep-sea phantoms, reduced to countless fields of debris. Facing this almost one-sided massacre, Major Walker had no room for retreat. For the previous 11 hours, he had commanded his destroyer like a tireless hunter, biting down hard on the tails of these hidden underwater ghosts across the vast ocean. Heavy depth charges were rolled into the sea wave after wave, their massive explosions echoing dully across the dark seabed and throwing up towering columns of white water. It was a war of attrition, an extreme tug of war of sheer willpower. Just when everyone thought this pursuit would drag into an endless, agonizing stalemate, the situation on the surface took a bizarre turn. The voice of the surface lookout, tinged with unconceivable confusion and excitement, shouted out a report to his commanding officer. A large amount of debris had appeared on the surface. Major Walker raised his binoculars and looked in the indicated direction. This is an untouchable iron law in the submariner's combat manual. Therefore, when these internal items, reeking of daily life, floated up, there was only one logical explanation. The submarine's pressure hull had been torn apart mercilessly by the depth charges. Freezing seawater had rushed into the compartments, and the supplies originally stored in the galley had been squeezed to the surface by the immense pressure. The crew on the destroyer began to cheer loudly, the tension that had gripped their nerves for over 10 hours finally releasing. It was a triumph. They could practically see the gruesome image of the German submarine thrashing in agony on the dark seabed, turning into a steel coffin. Yet, amidst this jubilant atmosphere, Major Walker froze at the chart table, his hands suspended in mid-air. As a top-tier hunter who had clashed with countless fox-like commanders, his intuition suddenly screamed that things were far from simple. He stared dead at the floating vegetable peels and breadcrumbs, his mind racing. If the submarine had truly been destroyed, why didn't the sonar equipment pick up that agonizing sound of twisting metal? When a hull is crushed by massive water pressure, why wasn't there a massive eruption of air bubbles? This debris appeared, far too perfectly timed, almost as if it were flawlessly choreographed to match the destroyer's attack rhythm. Major Walker suddenly felt a cold chill run down his spine. He realized that he was facing a group of madmen who had pushed psychological warfare to its absolute limit. It was a brilliant, colossal deception. The German submarine hadn't been sunk at all. They were exploiting the human desire for victory. The U-boat commanders, during the brief pauses between depth-charge bombardments, had coldly, unsystematically packed their leftovers and waste oil, firing them precisely to the surface through torpedo tubes or specially designed ejectors. What they wanted was exactly what they got: the ecstasy and subsequent relaxation of the destroyer crew upon seeing the debris. As long as the enemy on the surface believed the submarine was dead, thereby halting the depth charges, or even slowing down to fish out souvenirs, the submarine would gain a precious window to breathe, silently alter its course in the deep, and slip away like a ghost. Having pieced it all together, a cold, murderous intent flashed in Major Walker's eyes. He let out a cold laugh and, instead of ordering a ceasefire, issued a command. That shocked his entire crew. Ignore the floating items, maintain the current heading, keep the sonar completely locked on that supposed wreckage area, and prepare to deliver the fatal blow. Sure enough, several hundred feet below the surface, the German U-boat, thinking its clever trick had succeeded, was hovering silently in the water. The submariners were likely chuckling to themselves about the stupidity of the British, but what they waited for wasn't the fading sound of enemy propellers. Instead, it was a barrage of depth charges, precisely calibrated for their depth, smashing down on their heads like the Sith of the Grim Reaper. Following a series of catastrophic explosions, what erupted to the surface this time wasn't laughable peels, but massive plumes of heavy dark oil, twisted shards of steel, and the absolute despair of a German submarine meeting its definitive historical end. Inside this suffocating underwater prison, a young man named Armand, who by all rights should only have been flipping burgers in a rear echelon diner, was standing in the cramped, sweltering galley as a private first class in the ship's cook. His daily mission in this tiny metal box was to somehow conjure up variety from boring can rations to maintain the morale of the dozens of brothers on board. On a submarine, a hot meal was the only psychological comfort the men had each day. However, in this specific theater of war, even disposing of daily items was an extremely dangerous, highly technical operation. He knew the submariner's ironclad rule perfectly. Even the smallest for an object floating on the surface could summon a heavy barrage of depth charges from an enemy destroyer. The submarine was equipped with a special disposal unit. Every night when the sub crept to the surface, under the cover of darkness to ventilate and recharge its batteries, he had to carefully pack the day's accumulated potato peels, coffee grounds, leftover bones, and rotting cabbage into a specialized metal canister. Crucially, he had to add heavy iron weights inside to ensure that once ejected, the contents would plummet instantly into the pitch-black abyss, leaving not a single trace on the surface. Days dragged on in this monotonous, oppressive routine until a fateful moment arrived. During a reconnaissance mission, the American submarine's position was tragically exposed to Japanese Matsu-class destroyers, biting down like rabid dogs, quickly locked onto their location. The American captain made a split-second decision. Ordering an emergency dive, the submarine plunged toward the abyss at a terrifying angle. The immense water pressure squeezed the thick steel hull, making it groan and shriek as if it were about to be crumpled into scrap metal at any second. On the surface, the propellers of the Japanese destroyers circled directly overhead, sounding like the footsteps of death itself. Every sailor held his breath, some closed their eyes and began to pray. Suddenly, boom, boom. A relentless string of depth charges detonated all around them. The massive shockwaves violently tossed the crew against the bulkheads like ragdolls. The main lights instantly died, replaced by the eerie glow of the emergency red lights. A suffocating aura of panic and doom flooded the interior. The submarine was backed into a corner. The Japanese sonar maintained a death grip on them, no matter how the captain executed evasive maneuvers or altered their depth. The shadow of death looming above refused to dissipate. Oxygen inside the hull was thinning rapidly, and battery power was dangerously low. If this stalemate continued, they would either suffocate in a massive underwater tomb or be forced to surface and get blown to pieces by the destroyer's deck guns. In this life or death moment, when everyone felt the grim hands tightening around their throats, the captain's mind raced under the extreme pressure. He suddenly recalled a highly classified piece of Allied intelligence, the cunning deception used by German U-boats to fake their own destruction. His eyes pierced through the dim, flickering reed light and landed on Chef Armand, who was huddled in a corner, tightly clutching a large soup pot. An insanely reckless, almost absurd plan materialized instantly in the captain's mind. If the Germans could use this trick to fool the British, why couldn't they use it to fool the Japanese? He strode over to Armand and, in a severe, unquestionable tone, barked an order that made the cook question reality. Gather all the leftovers in the galley right now. Bring it all together. Do not add any weights, and prepare to fire it through the disposal unit. This calm and hit the cramped, reed-lit compartment like a thunderclap. But in the captain's piercing eagle-like eyes, there was absolutely no trace of madness or panic, only cold calculation. He stared the young cook down, gritting his teeth intensely as he repeated word by word, "Execute the order right now." In the strict military, obedience is paramount, and in the deep-sea abyss, his will is the only hope for their survival. The cook snapped out of his daze and scrambled quickly toward the store Ageria, which reeked heavily of sour decay. Several exhausted sailors, who normally wouldn't even look at the slop, charged over like madmen to assist him immediately. It was a frantic race against death. They grabbed handfuls of hardened, moldy bread scraps, potato peels, and gnawed bones. They even found a few cans of spoiled, rotting beans, shoving them all frantically into the heavy metal ejection canister. To make this parcel of death look perfectly authentic, the captain ordered a bucket of waste oil from the engine room. This thick diesel fuel was carefully mixed in with the nauseating food scraps. "Captain, the items are fully loaded now." The cook's voice trembled violently from extreme adrenaline. "Fire it, then the entire boat goes into ultra-quiet mode. Secure all non-essential machinery. Absolutely no movement is allowed." With a muffled mechanical thud of pressurization, the heavy brass valve of the specially designed disposal unit was thrown wide open. High-pressure air instantly shot out. The metal canister, packed tightly with organic scraps and thick waste oil, was forcefully ejected from the submarine. The moment it cleared the pressure hull completely, the steel canister opened exactly according to its preset mechanism. That filthy mixture of human sustenance and mechanical grime, lifted rapidly by the massive buoyancy of the deep water, it shot toward the surface like a completely silent arrow. Simultaneously, the submarine plunged into absolute silence. A deathly quiet enveloped the bottom of the sea. The ventilation systems were cut, turning the already suffocating cabin. The high-temperature cabin transformed into a literal purgatory. Exhausted sailors slumped onto the freezing metal deck. They were gasping desperately for air. Sweat cascaded down their foreheads, pooling noticeably on the cold steel floor. But no one dared to lift a hand to wipe it away, absolutely terrified that even the slight rustle of their fabric clothing would be picked up instantly by the hypersensitive enemy sonar systems directly above them. All they could do was pray. They prayed that their captain's insane leftover tactic would successfully deceive the ruthless Imperial naval forces above. Back on the violently turbulent surface, the two heavily armed destroyers were acting exactly like blood-crazed wolves. They were relentlessly pouring massive depth charges into the area. The sonar operator's ears were completely filled. He heard nothing but the static and echoes of underwater detonations. Suddenly, a vigilant lookout on one of the ships. He pointed at the water off the starboard bow and let out a triumphant, almost throat-tearing scream of pure victory. The enemy captain swiftly raised his polished binoculars. On the surface, which was churning violently like a cauldron. Boiling violently from the immense explosions, large, extremely thick patches of dark oil were bubbling to the surface. Immediately after, macabre trophies began to breach the chaotic surface one by one. There was half a loaf of swollen bread. It was completely soaked in cold seawater and heavily swollen. There were discarded potato peels bearing fresh knife cuts. There were vegetable remnants distinctly belonging to a Western diet, and even a torn, oil-stained fragment of an American sailor uniform. Under the sunlight of this cruel battlefield, these items looked jarring, yet perfectly logical. For the enemy captain, this scene was a textbook confirmation of a successful kill. In his mind, a submarine steel hull was the only thing protecting these deep-sea rats. Now, even the daily discarded items stored in the deepest part of the sub-galley and the crew personal clothing had been forced to the surface. What did this mean? It meant that the damn American submarine had been violently ripped apart by the intense barrage of depth charges. The crushing pressure of the deep had instantly imploded the compartments, and items that should never have seen the light of day were flushed upward by ruptured fuel tanks and flooding water. "Sir, target's sonar signal lost," the enemy sonar operator shouted. This cemented the captain's judgment. The submarine was now a powerless, steel coffin, sinking hopelessly into the pitch-black abyss. A wave of fanatic cheering erupted across the decks of the enemy destroyers. They believed they had executed a flawless hunt. To vent their remaining fury and ensure a perfect combat report, the captain ordered to final depth charges, set for shallow detonation, to be dropped over the slick of peels and oil, a hasty burial at sea for the vessel. Then, blowing their whistles arrogantly, the destroyers turned hard, their propeller noise slowly fading into the distance as they sailed away in triumph. Hundreds of feet below, the tension inside the American submarine had reached a breaking point. When those two shallow depth charges exploded nearby, the entire vessel shuddered violently, and the few remaining emergency red lights flickered out completely. In the pitch black, no one spoke, only the heavy, suppressed pounding of heartbeats echoed in the hull. Time ticked by agonizingly. It was perhaps the longest stretch of time the crew would ever experience in their lives. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour, until the sonar operator finally pulled off his headphones, his voice trembling with the ecstatic disbelief of a man who had just cheated death. "Captain, the enemy propellers are completely gone. They left. We are alive." After a single second of stunned silence, the entire compartment erupted in explosive, long-suppressed cheers. Grown men hugged each other fiercely in the dark, tears streaming down their faces, alongside the sweat. Armand Swisher, the young cook who was usually the target of complaints about his terrible food, was hoisted high into the air by a mob of frenzied sailors. With a pile of rancid discarded items that was supposed to be secretly destroyed, he had miraculously saved a multi-million-dollar steel leviathan and the lives of over 70 brothers. The captain let out a long, heavy sigh, his tightly wound nerves finally unraveling. He had succeeded. He had flawlessly replicated the psychological warfare tactic the Germans used against the British, adapting it to the Pacific and delivering a stinging slap to the face of the enemy navy. This event, later dubbed the Miracle of the Scraps, was quickly sent up the chain of command as top-secret intelligence to the highest echelons of the United States Pacific Fleet Submarine Force. Initially, the high-ranking admirals sitting in their spacious Pearl Harbor offices found the report absurd. To them, war was a clash of heavy steel and high explosives, a duel of radar and sonar. How could a few buckets of kitchen leftovers dictate the outcome of a battle? But as more battle-hardened submarine commanders stepped forward, validating the psychological value of this tactic through their own near-death experiences, the top brass finally recognized the brilliance of this seemingly ridiculous strategy. In the end, war is often a battle of human insight. When you push an enemy desperate desire for victory to its absolute peak, even the most rigorous logic will develop fatal blind spots. When you push an enemy desperate desire for victory to its absolute peak, even the most rigorous logic will develop fatal blind spots. Soon, an unprecedented, highly classified tactical directive was issued to every American submarine operating in the Pacific. This tactic was given a highly ironic codename Trash Master. From that moment on, the trash disposal unit on a U.S. submarine was no longer just a pipe for waste. It became an invisible artillery piece for psychological warfare. And submarine chefs like Armand were handed a highly specialized strategic duty. They had to meticulously design their garbage. Yes, design. To make the deception more convincing, American cooks began smashing leftover bones with hammers. They sliced spoiled meat into jagged pieces to mimic the effects of a violent explosion. They even intentionally mixed in torn fragments of discarded documents written in Japanese or German to utterly confuse enemies attempting to salvage trophies. Whenever a submarine found itself cornered and bombarded by enemy destroyers, the commander would order the ejection of this carefully curated camouflage of death. In the war years that followed, this leftover tactic, born from absolute desperation, orchestrated one miraculous escape after another across the vast ocean. Countless times, fierce Japanese destroyers or German escorts, seeing that slick of oil and food debris float to the surface, would smugly record a confirmed submarine kill in their logs. And at that exact moment, the Allied submarine they had condemned as scrap metal on the ocean floor would exploit the enemy relaxed guard, slipping quietly through the blockade like a phantom. Days later, they would resurface in a different sector, delivering fatal torpedoes into the bellies of enemy transport ships. It is a profound piece of dark humor in the art of war. In a slaughterhouse defined by steel and high-tech weaponry, humanity's most primal survival instincts manage to exert incredible power through the humblest, filthiest of mediums. Those potato peels and rotting cabbage leaves tossed out by submarine cooks possessed a strategic value that in specific historical moments surpassed the most advanced sonar systems and the deadliest depth charges. Looking back at this deep-sea legend buried by history, one cannot help but feel a profound sense of awe. War is not just a hardcore collision of national power. It is the ultimate test of psychology, willpower, and imagination under extreme conditions. A submarine chef like Armand might never have been awarded prestigious medals, remaining a speck of dust in the grand river of history. Yet, that bucket of sour, foul-smelling scraps in his hands didn't just shatter the enemy arrogant certainty. It left behind an eternal testament to human resilience and extraordinary ingenuity in the cruelest of battlegrounds. It tells us that on the razor edge between life and death, we must never underestimate the astonishing creativity humanity can unleash just to survive. Even with nothing but a pile of garbage in hand, with enough wisdom and courage, it can be transformed into the ultimate weapon to defeat the grim Reaper himself. This is the most chilling, yet undeniably magnificent, true history of deep-sea warfare. If you enjoyed this dive into the hidden truths of World War II naval combat, do not forget to share and subscribe. We will uncover more forgotten historical legends in the next episode.